So today we're going to take a look at backing up your Synology to S3, which turned out to be a little bit more complex than I originally thought. So let's jump in. So let's say you have a Synology device and you've decided you want to go down the route of setting up an offsite backup, and you've looked at the different cloud service providers and decided you're going to go with S3. So setting up S3 is actually quite easy because it's integrated into Hyper Backup. However, if you care about how much money you're going to spend in that process, well, things are going to get a bit more difficult. So what we're going to do in this video is walk through how to configure Hyper Backup for S3, and we'll take a look at what the backup looks like on the S3 side, and then the cost implications of your choices there. Then we'll take a look at doing the same backup to Glacier and how much that costs, and we'll probably end up doing another video, which is ultimately how to do the cheapest offsite backup possible, even though it may require a bit more manual work. But why don't we get started with the simple Hyper Backup S3 configuration. So here I have our DSM opened, and like I said, this is super simple since it's already in Hyper Backup. So what we're going to do is we're going to start Hyper Backup. If you don't have Hyper Backup installed, you can just go to the package manager. So as you can see, I actually already have an S3 backup configured since I was playing around with it, but we're going to go ahead and add a new one. And so what we'll do is, for this demo, we're just going to select folders and packages. We're going to back up a shared folder. Go down in the backup wizard, you select S3 storage. And for the server, you can just pick the Amazon S3. I'm going to assume we're just doing one of their standard endpoint servers, and you're going to need an access key and a secret key. And the way you get those is, obviously you're going to need to set up an AWS account, which I'm not going to walk through in this, but assuming you have your AWS account already set up, you can come into the console, and then what you're going to need to do is go into the upper right-hand corner here under your account, and you're going to have to open security credentials. And under the security credentials page, you can see this is where you get access keys to send programmatic calls from the AWS CLI, other tools, etc. Now, I want to be clear in that these are root access keys, and they allow you to access everything on your account, which I think for personal purposes is probably okay. But if you want to apply like better security practices to this, I would probably look into setting up an IAM user, roles, etc. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new access key here. And it even says it, root user access keys are not recommended. Again, I'm just going to go ahead and say yes. We're going to create the access key. So now you have your access key set up. You can come back to the DSM. And you're going to enter those two values here under access key and secret key. And then that's going to go ahead and log in. And it's going to ask you on which bucket you want to store your files. And in this case, on this account, I have no buckets. So I will just create a new bucket, and we will put this in the region of US East Ohio. I mean, why not? And we will just call this Sonoran Test Backup. Bucket names are globally unique, so if you do something like Synology Backup, it's going to be taken. So you probably want to find a prefix which is unique to you, or suffix, whatever you want to do. And it comes up with a directory name where it's going to store your backups. You can change this to whatever you want, but I will just leave it with the default of NAS 1-1. So if you were to create another backup, it'll do 1_2. And we'll say next, because we're creating a new backup task. Now we're going to pick the shared folder to backup. And for this, I made a shared folder and I put some files in it. I think about 20 gigabytes of just zip files. And so we're just going to pick to back that up. You can back up applications as well. In this case, I'm not going to set up anything. Now here's where you can go over the backup settings if you want to do it on a regular basis, if you want to run integrity checks, compress the data, etc. So the one thing to keep in mind here, and this is where things get super important, is what storage class do you want to use? And this greatly impacts the cost of your backup. And so here it supports standard, intelligent tiering, reduced redundancy storage, infrequent access, and one zone infrequent access. And like when you start to kind of sift through this and understand the costs, you're probably going to need a PhD in this. The other thing to consider is that API calls cost money as well. So I would believe that if you are running an integrity check and you're doing reads on the data, those calls may cost money. But here's what we're going to do. Over here on this tab, I have the S3 pricing chart, and I have it set to the US East region, which is where we configured this. So let's look up the price for standard. Your first 50 terabytes is going to be 0.023 cents per gigabyte. Let's do a little bit of math just to make this real. And let's say you have a backup that is, let's say 5 terabytes. So you can have roughly 5,000 gigabytes times 0.023. That's going to cost you $115 per month just for the storage fee at the standard tier. That doesn't even include the price of other operations. But let's get to that. So that's standard. Well, let's assume these get cheaper. Let's look at one zone infrequent access. And this looks like, well, other than the Glacier, this is going to be your cheapest option available within Hyper Backup. And that's key to remember. The cheapest option available within Hyper Backup. And going back to our math page, if you were to go with that, got that wrong. That's $50 a month. So you go $50 a month to store 5 terabytes of information, or $600 a year. Now, of course, if you're just looking at this page, you're like, well, wait a second, there's much cheaper options here. I want to use S3 Glacier Deep Archive. I mean, that is way cheaper, 0.0099. It's $5 a month. $50 a month down to $5 a month just by changing a different storage tier. But you notice those storage tiers are not an option in configuring Hyper Backup, and we'll look into that. But hey, so that is just for storage. Let's take a quick look at data transfer. So data transfer in is free. Data transfer out, first 10 terabytes a month. And so let's just say that you wanted to get all this information back. It is a backup, so probably not a common case. I almost don't believe that. 100 gigabytes of data transfer out to the internet free each month, maybe 100, so that would be 4,900. I'm going to say 4,900. You're looking over $400 to get your data back. If I did that right, if you're an AWS expert, correct me on this. But the data egress is going to be very expensive. So there are additional costs to consider too. And this comes down to the access patterns of your data. And you can see here, you pay for requests made against your S3 buckets and objects. Request costs are based on the request type and are charged on the quantity of requests as listed in the table. So you can have put, copy, post, list, get, select, delete, and cancel requests are free. And so again, if we look at that most expensive storage class, the standard, you can see how it's difficult to understand how much you're going to pay for this. And so if I go back to this page, this is where the behavior is a little difficult to understand. I think the point I want you to take home from this is you may set this all up and you may end up with a bill that you were surprised by. So do keep that in mind. So let's just say we pick one zone infrequent access. We know that's going to be the cheapest option. We calculated that at $50 for 5 terabytes. If you're doing an integrity check, this is obviously doing some type of read or check operations on the S3 objects, and that is going to cost money as well. It's not clear what the call pattern is, what it's doing on each object. Unfortunately, you'd probably have to run it and look at your bill to understand what's happening. So keep that in mind. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to disable this. As an aside, I think on those API calls, they said the delete operation is free. So you would think, hey, going and deleting backups during a backup rotation wouldn't cost any money. However, I think the operations to do a list or an LS on your objects cost money. So even your rotation could cost money. So I'm just going to disable that. All right, let's see if the DSM decided to save backup now. Let's say yes. So we're going to let this run and we'll come back when it's finished. All right, well, the backup is done. So let's take a look at the results of that. So what's cool is if we open up the Backup Explorer, you can take a look and see what's in the backup right here in the DSM. And as you can see, I just threw a bunch of 2 gigabyte zip files in there. You can do all the standard backup statistics, etc. But what's cool is, since this is on S3, you can just go over to the AWS console And let's see what this backup looks like in the S3 console. So we'll go into S3, and you can see right here, this is the bucket we created. And then within that bucket, it created a directory containing all the backup information. So you can see there's a whole bunch of metadata associated with the backup. It is nice that you can go in, you can browse this, even if you didn't have access to a Synology, you could pull this down on your own and figure out what to do with it. So that is pretty cool. Now, the other thing that you may wonder is, how much did that cost? We just uploaded 8 gigabytes of data. We know the transfer was free since we saw that. But let's say you want to go understand, were there any additional costs to this? What does my storage cost look like, etc. And what you can do is you can open up the Cost Explorer tool. So we'll do billing and cost management. And I'm going to open the Cost Explorer. So this is this tool you have to configure to get exactly the right view you want. But since we just did that, I'm going to go over, I'm going to change the granularity to daily. And I would just pick past 1 day. And for the service, I'm going to choose S3. But there's the rub. There's no S3 in here because there's no data in this report yet. Now, if I wanted to do something, you're like, well, I'm just going to choose hourly because I really want to see a fine-grained look at this. Again, the data is not in there. And interestingly enough, hourly or resource level data is not enabled. So believe it or not, for some of these cases to get hourly level data, you actually have to pay a little more. So that's something else to keep in mind. Imagine you're setting up this backup and you're like, hey, I'm going to run a couple tests to see how much it costs. I'm going to see what the API calls are look like. You're not going to be able to go over to the Cost Explorer right away and see the results and do a quick iteration on this. And you're not going to be able to see the hourly data without incurring extra fees. So that's something to keep in mind. But let's summarize where we are on S3, since that pretty much concludes setting up Hyper Backup to use S3, backing it up, exploring it. But let's think about, like, it was definitely easy to set up and configure. All I had to do was go a few clicks. I had to set up my AWS account. Really easy, it worked. No errors, pretty much worked on the first try. S3 is a very good service, highly available. You can choose different redundancy options depending on how much you want to spend. It will be a great backup option for you if you want. Again, simple, easy, reliable. But, that comes at a price. Like, as we saw, like, the cheapest we could do 5 terabytes for was about $50 a month. And that didn't even include all the potential other fees if you want to maintain integrity, etc. But if we jump back to the pricing page, we saw there are definitely cheaper options, especially if we go with Glacier. So how do we do that? So what we're going to do now is we're going to show you how to do the same backup, but we're going to do it using Glacier. Now, Glacier is actually, I feel like they're in the process of converging S3 and Glacier into a single product. But if you go into the services menu, you can actually see S3 Glacier as a standalone product. Yet in the S3 menu itself, it shows Glacier as different storage tiers within S3. So it's a little bit confusing at the moment, but I will just show you how to configure Glacier on your Synology. And the way you do this is using the Glacier app. And so you can go into your package center, search for Glacier Backup, and open it. And you can see I was testing this, but let's just kind of go through the process of setting up a Glacier Backup. Very similar to the S3 process. So we're going to go to backup. We're going to do create, and I will say, and this is worth reading. According to the Glacier pricing policy, you'll be charged a fee according to the total space and number of file uploading requests. Change of file names or file paths will trigger an uploading request for archiving files. So if you go the Glacier route, you definitely need to understand the Glacier pricing structure as well, because it has pricing around requests, it has pricing around data retrieval. Like, getting data out of Glacier can be quite expensive and it can take a long time. Now we need to enter the same access key and secret key we added before. So we're going to put it in US East again. Sure, we'll do transfer encryption. And this will do multi-part uploads. So it'll, if you have a large file like I just did, a 2 gigabyte file, behind the scenes when uploading to Glacier, it'll do that as a multi-part upload. And so actually the biggest is 512 megabytes. That's interesting. So we'll just leave that. We'll pick the same folder. We're not going to schedule it. So now we'll let this one run. All right, the Glacier backup is done. So let's take a look at it. Similar to Hyper Backup, you can go into it and you can browse the backup itself. So let's do, so we can explore the backup set. Not surprisingly, there are files. You can actually look at a log of the backup as well. And in the log, you can get a sense of the type of requests it made to Glacier, which can help you in your cost estimation as well. So let's take a look at what this looks like on the Glacier side. So we'll go back over to the AWS console, and now we will choose S3 Glacier. And here are the two vaults. This is where things get a little tricky with Glacier and the Glacier app. So it's not clear what is in these vaults or what they're doing. Just looking at it, well, obviously there's NAS1, which is the name of my NAS in this case. My guess is this first vault contains the actual data, and this is some type of, surprisingly, mapping information. Maybe it's something about mapping what files or go with what metadata, et cetera. I don't know. But here's where it's hard is you're like, oh, well, I'm just going to go in and take a look at this. And the answer is like, no, you're not. These vaults are not explorable in the AWS console. So I just clicked into the vault itself. This is all the information I got. It doesn't even have information about how many archives are in the vault. Archives, think of them, are similar in concept to files. And so Glacier is long-term storage platform. And so you don't even get up-to-date inventory or list information on a regular basis. It needs to go run that in the background. So you're like, I don't know what's here. However, I do know it was created recently, and that's it. And so if I go into I'll go back to my vaults and I go into the mapping, that's all there is. So the only way to get more information about this, now, sorry, compare this to what we did with our S3 buckets. On S3, we just opened it up, went to the bucket, we can start to browse it, we could even download it from here, whatever. In Glacier, it's pretty opaque. Really, the only way to interact with these vaults and the contents of the vaults is through the AWS command line tools. So you'll need to download those, install them, and honestly, like sift your way through the documentation to figure out how they work. I'm going to show you a little bit about what that looks like. So once you have the AWS command line interface installed, if you do want to do something simple, like list the vaults that you have to run a command like the one right here. You're going to have to do a fair amount of Googling and sifting through documentations just to get this. But it's AWS, the subcommand is Glacier, list vaults, and you give it an account ID, and you might need to give it a region depending on how you configure your command line. So this should work. And so not surprisingly, we get a response back, which shows the two vaults that we see in the window behind us right here. Now, what if we want to see what is inside one of those vaults? That's a completely different command. If you do some Googling, you will find that this is the command. So what you need to do is run an initiate job. You're going to give it a vault name. So I'm going to take this first vault name from up here, your account ID, and then you're going to give it a little bit of JSON, which tells it the type of job to do, and it's going to be an inventory retrieval. Now this is an asynchronous process, so this is going to kick off the job. And now you're going to hang out. Now remember, Glacier is, it's a long-term storage service. It's not fast. And so you got back a pointer to the job ID, which of course you can query the status of it. So let's go ahead and do that. And you do that with, I had to look it up. So we have to pass in these parameters, and then we also have to give it the job ID, which is this long string right here. So that just tells us about the status of the job we started, and you can see it's not completed and it's in progress. Now you're probably thinking, hey, no problem. This is quick. There's only a couple objects in there. I'll just wait for this response. No. If you want to go do this, I would recommend maybe going and running some errands if you have some grocery shopping to do or something else. Because in my experience, every time I've run this, even on a small vault with only a couple archives inside of it, it's taken hours, like 3 to 4 hours to come back with a response. But let me jump ahead. But I do have the output from a previous job I did that shows the response. It has the inventory date and it has a list of archives. Each of these archives is effectively a file. And you can see the archive ID, description, size. I think they were little image files, and that's it. So you get this JSON blob with these thousands of archive descriptions. And so that's it. Like, if you want to interact with Glacier, you're not getting much out of the UI. You're going to end up using a bunch of command line tools. And even using the command line tools, the output is not particularly obvious. So how much did all that cost? Again, we're not sure because the data hasn't flown through to the Cost Explorer yet. However, and again, it's really actually hard to tell what storage tier you're using with Glacier, but I did some back of the envelope math, and if we're just using like one of the flexible retrieval, I think it did instant retrieval storage tiers for 5 terabytes, but it was about $20 for 5 terabytes. So we went from $50 with kind of the most expensive S3 option. We played around with Glacier and we've kind of seen it's not the easiest thing to work with. And I think you can get the price down to less than half that. But bringing it all back, and I'm gonna go back to the pricing page here, for me, this is where I really want my data, because this would bring my price down to, for 5 terabytes, about $5 a month. It sounds awesome. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna wrap it up here. I hope this was a little bit of a survey of how to kind of configure S3 with Hyper Backup if you want to go down the Glacier route, what that looks like. And I think you get a sense of the pros and cons and trade-offs of each of them. There's nothing wrong with the S3 integration. It was super simple to set up, and it depends on how much data you have, how frequently that data is going to change, how frequently you want it backed up, how frequently you're going to access it, etc. And you can find the right solution for you. The S3 thing, if you don't have terabytes of data, might only cost you a few bucks a month, and maybe it's worth it. It's super easy and it works. But for me, I have at least 5 terabytes of data. I won't access it very often, if ever. And it's not rapidly changing. So I want to find a solution that allows me to use Glacier Deep Archive. And so we'll look at that in the next video. That's it for now, and we'll see you next time.